Okay, thank you. How are you doing again? Those of you that just arrived. Let's bow our heads and let's pray. Father in heaven, thank you so much for helping me to look at your word. Thank you for guiding me through your word. Thank you for giving me this message that I can share with your children here today. Thank you so much for that, Father. And please guide me. Just guide me, Father, so that everything that I say, everything that comes out of my mouth, Father, is guided by your Holy Spirit. In the name of your Son, Jesus, we're asking you this. Amen. Okay, we may sit down. So, last time that I was with you, we spoke about the 1 Samuel chapter 20, and we looked at that story, and we did not focus specifically on that friendship that David and Jonathan had, but we talked about this possible big conflict. Actually, there's a potential big conflict that could have taken place, and it could have blown out really bad and really ugly, right? But we saw how these two good friends were able to avoid that conflict. And the reason they were able to do that is because they were men of God. And as such, as men of God, they had certain attributes, right? They had some very important attributes. In fact, we named 8 attributes that they had. For those of you who may not remember, they were humility. Remember how humble David was in the way he came when he said that, you know, what is it that I did? Is it something that I could have done? And we saw how Jonathan showed humility when he said, what can I do to help you to understand my point of view, or so that we can understand each other better. I mean, I'm paraphrasing. And then we saw that they were selfless, right? They didn't care. They were not thinking about each other. About themselves, excuse me. They were thinking about their friend, the other person. We saw how they had all this trust towards each other. They both had to put a lot of trust in the other person. David had to put a lot of trust that Jonathan was not going to betray him and get him killed. And Jonathan had to put a lot of trust that David would stick around and wait so that he could show him that he was either right or wrong. Turns out Jonathan was wrong, but David stuck around. And so we saw that they had a lot of trust in God, right? They brought God to be the witness between them. And in fact, there's a beautiful verse that just really, I want to read it to you, because at the end of this agreement that they made, he says, as for the agreement, this is in verse 23, 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 23, it says, as for the agreement of which you and I have spoken, behold, the Lord is between you and me forever. So they brought God into the agreement, they brought God into their discussion, so they trusted God to help them out. And then they had very effective communication, right? David specifically told him, I'm telling you, your dad is going to kill me. And Jonathan is like, no, I don't think he is. He told me, I know he's not going to kill you. And then, but he said, well, what can I do to show you? And then David makes a proposition, right? He says, well, here's what's going to happen. In a few days, there's going to be this feast, and your dad is going to have this banquet, etc. And so during that time, when that happens, perhaps you can do A, B, C, and D. And he specified what he thought could be done that would help satisfy him. And so he explained that, and then we saw how Jonathan said, okay, that's fine. I'll go along with that. We'll bring God into the picture. We'll show God would be the one that would be the witness. And then Jonathan explains specifically, okay, so this is specifically how this will play out, okay? On the third day of this feast or whatever, here's what's going to happen. You come over here, you stay right here, I'm going to go there, and I'm going to do this and this. I'm going to ask this question to my dad, and based on his response, then I will react and I will do this if he says one way, or I'll do that if he says something else. And so this way you'll know exactly where my father stands. And so they communicated very effectively without questioning each other, but understanding each other. And so they had effective communication. They had a lot of love for each other, okay? They demonstrated the love because love is giving of yourself to the other. And that's what Jonathan was doing towards David. And that's what David did towards Jonathan. And they had a lot of loyalty. We see that even at the end, when they were both, when they realized that yes, King Saul did want to kill David, and when they both came to that to that conclusion, we see that David didn't go and say, "See, I told you so." No, they were still together, and they continued to keep their friendship. And they departed, but they knew, but they made an agreement that David would not forget Jonathan, right? And that they would be together always, you know, maybe not in real, alive, living, but their friendship would be forever, right? And then the last one was integrity. They both had integrity. They said, "This is what I will do." And they did what they said they would do. They didn't say, "I'll do this," and do something else. So these were the 8 important attributes that we went over in detail last time around. Okay? The reason I'm bringing those up today as an introduction, I know that's a long introduction, right? Yeah. Is because there's a contrast. You see, by contrast, there was another character in the story of 1 Samuel chapter 20. And I was going to gloss over this other character because I thought, there's not really much there to say about him. But I was kind of go towards the next chapter, chapter 21, to continue preparing for the next message. But somehow God would not let me go to chapter 21 until I dealt with this section, which we already went over, but we missed this one character. This character that I'm talking about is King Saul. All right? And I was going to gloss over King Saul's role in this story in 1 Samuel chapter 20. And I thank God that he did not let me gloss over it, because I happen to have learned a lot of things from this section of the story. That section of the story is found in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 24 through 34. All right? So I'm going to read it. If you open your Bibles in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 24 through 34, I'm going to read it for you. And then I'm going to let you know what I learned from it, because I want to share it with you, because I think that it would help a lot of us in so many ways. So here it is. Verse 24. So David hid in the field, and when the new moon came, the king sat down to eat food. The king sat on his seat as usual, the seat by the wall. Then Jonathan rose up, and Abner sat down by Saul's side, but David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not speak anything that day, for he thought, "It is an accident. He is not clean. Surely he is not clean." It came about the next day, the second day of the new moon, that David's place was empty. So Saul said to Jonathan, his son, "Why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal, either yesterday or today?" Jonathan then answered Saul, "David earnestly asked leave of me to go to Bethlehem. For he said, 'Please let me go, since our family has a sacrifice in the city, and my brother has commanded me to attend. And now, if I have found favor in your sight, please let me go away, that I may see my brothers. For this reason, he has not come to the king's table. Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now, send and bring him to me, for he must surely die. But Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be put to death? What has he done? Then Saul hurled his spear at him to strike him down. So Jonathan knew that his father had decided to put David to death. Then Jonathan arose from the table in fierce anger and did not eat food on the second day of the new moon, for he was grieved over David because his father had dishonored him. So that's the story, okay? And so now I'm going to tell you there's three things that I learned from this character, David. The first thing I learned was what happens when you make yourself more important than God. Okay? So I learned that. I'll share that with you in a minute. Number two, I learned that the insanity of what sin will make a person do. Okay? The insanity that sin causes a person to do. That's the second thing I learned. And the third thing I learned was, does the trigger produce or cause the outcome, or does it reveal something? Okay, I'll explain that later. But does the trigger produce or cause the outcome, or does it reveal something? So let me go through each one of those 3 points that I learned from this character. So number 1, if you look at your Bibles again in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 30 and 31. Okay, you remember when we read here that it said, for as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must die. Oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to read verse 30th. Okay, so I'm going to read it again in a minute because I don't want to get you guys mixed up. What happened here is that Saul had just finished asking his son Jonathan, okay, where is David? He wanted to know why David was not there. And then Jonathan responded to him that the way that he had planned with David and why he was not coming, okay? And this is the way that Saul responded. So I'm going to read verse 30 and 31 again for you, okay? Then Saul's anger burned against Jonathan, and he said to him, you son of a perverse, rebellious woman, do I not know that you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame and to the shame of your mother's nakedness? For as long as the son of Jesse lives on the earth, neither you nor your kingdom will be established. Therefore now send and bring him to me, for he must surely die. So this is the response. Now I want you to stop for a moment, okay, and think about what was the mental and emotional state that Saul was in when he responded to this question. What was his mental and emotional state? Okay? Does anybody know? Think about it. Okay, I'll tell you. He was angry, right? He was angry, very upset. He was frustrated. Okay? He was very frustrated that his son could not get this. He was bitter. You could see bitterness coming out because it's like he just can't stand for David to be there, and it's like he's continuing to live and he wants to put him to death and he hasn't been able to, so he's getting very, very bitter. And there's also, there was like a sense of helplessness It's like, guys, I've been trying to get this guy killed, and I can't get this guy killed, and I was hoping he was going to come here, and I thought that if he would come here, then I would get to kill him. But now he's not coming here, so now I can't get to kill him. Now I have to figure out another plan, you know? And I'm like running out of plans here, and I got to get this guy killed. So there was a sense of helplessness. And this was this illogical thinking, right? That like that David is going to come there so he can kill him, you know, after he already tried to kill him before. And then, I mean, you see what he does, right? He tries to kill his own son because of the fact that David didn't come. So you see,
He saw his son as a traitor.
that's right. He saw his son as a traitor. Exactly. Okay. So this was his emotional and his mental state of mind, right? Angry, bitter, frustrated, feeling helpless, illogical. All right. So the question is, why was he being like this? Why was Saul feeling or thinking like this? Why? Well, let's look at what he wanted, okay? What did he want? Saul wanted, and this may sound logical, Saul wanted his son to become the next king. Saul was thinking in his mind, I'm the king, I've got this royal line that started with me, and I want this royal line to continue with my descendants. I want my son to be king. I want his children to be the next part of the royalty, king or queen or whatever. And he just thought that he would want this royalty, this kingdom, to continue in the hands of his family. That's what he wanted. He was the first king. And he wanted to continue his family to follow that royal line that he has started. Okay? That's what he wanted. Now, is there anything wrong with that? I mean, what's wrong with that? What parent does not want the best for their children? I mean, as a father, he wants the best for his son, right? So what's wrong with wanting the best for your son and fighting for it? Is there anything wrong with that? Well, on the surface, we would say no. Of course, there's nothing wrong with that. But when you look a little deeper, you realize that there was something wrong with what he wanted. What was wrong with what Saul wanted? Anybody? It wasn't God's will. Okay? It was not the will of God. That's what was wrong with what he wanted. It was not the will of God. So you see, God had chosen a different person that was not a direct descendant of himself, Saul, okay, to become the next king. And so that's what God wanted. And so you say, well, wow. And you say, well, why did God not want Saul to continue being the leader of this family, this royal family? Why would God choose somebody else? Anybody remember why? Okay. That's right, because Saul had chosen to be rebellious. He had chosen to be disobedient to God. Okay? He had chosen to do whatever he wanted to do. He did not agree with God. You see, God said, I'm going to choose another king. That's God's will. But Saul says, I don't care what your will is. I want the next king to be my son. All right? So all of a sudden we see here that Saul is starting to show that he feels that he is more important than God. Because God is saying, my will is for David to be king. And Saul is basically saying, I don't care what your will is. I want my son Jonathan to be king. You see that? So when a person starts going against God's will, what is that person demonstrating? He is demonstrating that he or she is more important than God. They're showing like, look, I don't care what you, God, says. I'm going to do what Saul, thinks I should do. I'm more important than you. Okay? And what I want to do is what needs to happen. So basically, as I said, Saul is thinking that he's more important than God. And he wanted to force his will upon the situation here in terms of who was going to be the next king. Now, what happens? What happens to a person like Saul when he tries to put himself in a place that he is more important than God? Then his will is more important than God. What happened? What happened to this guy? Okay?
He starts getting harder.
His plan doesn't work. Okay? Because God has more power. So no matter how much you want to do your will above God, it's not going to work. All right? God is God, and God is more powerful than anybody else. And so it starts to create a frustration because you want to do this and you can't get it done, and you want to do it no matter what, and it can't happen, and you're unsuccessful over and over again, so you start getting frustrated. And then that frustration starts bringing anger. You start getting angry. And after a while, you start becoming very bitter. And then after a while, you start feeling like a sense of helplessness. And eventually, you start thinking illogical things that don't make sense. How does it make sense that you're going to be more powerful than God? How does it make sense that you are more important than God? How does that make sense? See, that doesn't make sense. You see, in contrast, Jonathan was different. Jonathan also realized that he was not going to be king, that God has chosen somebody else to be king. And how did he react to it? Did he try to impose his will and say, no, I don't care, I'm the crown prince, I'm going to be the next king? Did he do that? No. He surrendered to God, he submitted to God, and let God continue to do his will. I mean, not that he's letting God do his will, but he just allowed the will of God to be done, right? He didn't try to change God's will in any way, and he accepted that. And so what happened to Jonathan because of that? He had peace, right? He had joy. In fact, he was able to rejoice with David, with his friend. And he found God's favor because David promised them that he was going to take care of him or his descendants. And if we continue reading the story, we find out that in fact, David did take care of the descendants of Jonathan. All right? So now, you see, to put it in practical terms, here's what happens. People today live in a way where they say they believe in God, but really, they don't. Because really, they want to live and they want to do their will the way they want to, and they really could care less what God says. All right? There was a time, I'm going to give you an example about my son Jeremy. There was a time when he wanted to work for Apple, right? So he applied for Apple, and then because his friend Joshua was working there, Jonathan was working there, and he's like, well, you know, Joshua and I, we're about the same in this area. I can work there too. And so he went and applied, and he got through that first interview. Then he got through that second interview. Then he went through that third interview. And then he waited for the response, and he was telling me, surely I got this job. I mean, I went through the third interview. Surely I got it. And then all of a sudden, he doesn't get the call. He didn't get the job, right? So then he's like feeling sad, feeling a little depressed, like, wow, I can't believe this. I don't know why I didn't get it, you know? And it is depressing, right? When you think you're going to get something, you want something, and you think that should be okay, and it should be within God's will. But we talked about it and decided that, you know what? Perhaps it was not God's will for you to be working at Apple, you know? But that's a good company, and I would make a good salary, and et cetera, et cetera. And I go, yeah, but perhaps that's not God's will. And so Jeremy accepted that. And you know what? As time went by, we realized it was definitely not God's will. So it wasn't because maybe he wasn't qualified. It wasn't because maybe he wasn't as good as somebody else. It's because it wasn't God's will for him to work there. And how do I know that? Because by him not working there, God helped him to start this business. And when he started this business, and he started working, he met somebody, right? He met this beautiful girl named Selena. And then he married her. And now she's my beautiful daughter-in-law. And I am so grateful to God that I have this beautiful daughter-in-law who I love so much. And she's just so good, so nice. And I'm just so happy with that. And they're like perfect for each other. You know, they work together, they do all this stuff together, and they like the same things. And it's like, I don't know, it's like it's like a marriage that was made, you know, in heaven or something, right? So anyways, that would not have happened had he gone to work for Apple, you see? So the point I'm trying to make is that sometimes God's will is different than our will, but God knows the future and we don't. So just because we want something to happen a certain way, like Saul, I want my son to be the next king. Just because you may want something to be done a certain way does not mean that that's God's will. And so if it doesn't get done your way, it's probably because it's not God's will, especially if you're asking God for help. Because we prayed for God to give Jeremy that job at Apple. We prayed about it, and God didn't do it. So we had to accept that's not God's will, and we later found out why, right? There's the proof right there, okay? So that's what we have to understand. We cannot make ourselves more important than God because God has a will. And by us trying to make ourselves more important than God, what happens is we go through all those ugly emotional and mental states of mind. Now, number 2, okay? The second thing is that the insanity of what sin will make a person do, okay? For this, so we know in this particular section that Saul was living in a big sin. Yes or no? He was living a sinful life because he was disobeying God. He was being rebellious, right? He was being very arrogant. He would continue to do things his way instead of doing it God's way. So David was living a life of sin for the most part. And so what happens here, let's look at 1 Samuel now, chapter 20, and verse 25 through 27. Okay, and let's see what had just happened. Okay, he had just sent 3 different groups of people or servants to kill David. Remember that? He had done that. He sent 3 different groups of servants to go kill David. And then when they didn't do it, then he went himself to go kill David. And then David, didn't get killed because God intervened. And so then now, okay, he has the audacity to think like this. He says, the king sat, again, I'm reading verse 25 to 27. The king sat on his seat as usual, the seat by the wall. Then Jonathan rose up, and Abner sat down by Saul's side. But David's place was empty. Nevertheless, Saul did not speak anything that day, for he thought, it is an accident. He is not clean. Surely he is not clean. It came about the next day, the second day of this new moon, that David's place was empty. So Saul said to Jonathan his son, why has the son of Jesse not come to the meal, neither yesterday nor today? Okay, I want you to think about what's happening here. Okay? This guy is trying to kill David. And he tries multiple times to kill David. And then he's expecting that David is going to come to his house for dinner? Is that not insane?
Yes.
Well, he told Jonathan he wasn't.
Yeah, right. But the point is that Saul knew that he was killing him, and he went over there to find him. He went to hunt him down and to kill him. And then he didn't kill him. Did he think that David didn't realize that they were out there to try to kill him? So, I mean, to me, that's crazy, okay? If you're trying to kill me, and then you invite me to come to your house, don't expect for me to show up, because I know you're trying to kill me. So, I mean, it just doesn't make sense. It's completely crazy. So that's what I'm saying. Look at the insanity. Now, let's look at another part here. 1 Samuel 20, verse 32 to 33. It says, "But Jonathan answered Saul his father and said to him, why should he be put to death?" Like, why should David be put to death? "And what has he done?" Then look at what Saul did. Saul hurled his spear at him, meaning at Jonathan, to strike him down. Okay, I want you to think about this for a moment. Saul wants Jonathan to be the next king. So because Jonathan is questioning why does he want to kill David, what does Saul do? He tries to kill his own son. Okay? "Son, I want you to be king." "Oh, you don't want to be king? Okay, let me kill you." Is that crazy? Is that not insane? You see, I mean, in fact, it wasn't only just that crazy, the fact that he tried to kill him, but I want you to imagine the scene here. Who was there? There was Abner, and there was other people there at the table. This was a feast. They had all these guests. And in front of all those guests, Saul throws a spear to try to kill his son in front of all these witnesses. For no reason. Just because his son asked a question. So you tell me, is that not insane? Is that not crazy? You see, when you are sinning, okay, when you are sinning, you do things that are crazy. You do things that are insane, that don't make any sense. But to you at the moment, when you're doing these insane things, you don't think about it, right? You don't realize that what you're doing is insane. So, I have this example of this man. There was this man who was a pastor at a particular church. And this man was a very good preacher and a very good teacher. And he used to teach. One of the things that I really liked about him is the way he taught. And one of the things that I learned from him is he said, you know, he used this expression for us not to wear a mask. And this was a lot of years before this pandemic, where now people actually wear a physical mask, right? But he's talking about wearing this mask of trying to cover who you really are. So he really emphasized the idea that we should have, that we should be transparent, that we should be transparent people, that we should have integrity and be honest, that we should not try to, in front of people, be one person, and then behind the people, be another person. He was trying to teach us that. And he did a good job at teaching that, okay? He taught us very well in not doing that. Well, one day, this particular pastor, evidently he wasn't happy with his salary that he was getting. And so he took good control of the local board. And then he would tell the treasurer of the board, listen, I need a check for this. And the treasurer would write it, because, well, he's the pastor, right? How can you question the pastor? And then he said, well, here, write me a check for that. And the treasurer would write a check for that. And then now I need a check for this other thing. Okay, and the treasurer would write a check for that other thing. And so this didn't happen one time or 1 month. This thing kept on happening over and over again. Month after month after month, this guy is asking for money for all these different things. Well, one day the treasurer wakes up and realizes, you know what? Something's not right about this. You know? I mean, because you see the pastor now started saying, why don't you do this? Why don't you just give me some blank checks, you sign them, you know, like give me 3 or 4 blank checks, you sign them, and then I'll fill them in when I spend it in the things I need to spend, and then I'll just give you the checks back. I mean, well, you'll get the council checks through the statement or whatever, okay? So, you know, he started getting a little bit more bold, right, doing that, and so the treasurer's like, okay, all right, I'll sign the checks and give them to you blank so you can spend them on whatever. But then that's when he finally woke up and said, wait a second, something is not right here. Why am I signing blank checks to give to the pastor? That doesn't make sense. So what does he do? He questions the pastor. He said, brother, you know what? I don't think this is right. I don't think I should be doing this. I don't think you, I think you should, there's a better way to do this that, about accountability, transparency, etc., right? I think we should do it better. Well, anyways, to make a long story short, pastor was not happy with that. And so this big problem ensued because of that. And so then eventually the leaders higher up in the church went and spoke to the pastor and told him, hey, you can't do that. And you can't just go and change it and put people on the board at your will. They have to be elected and whatever, right? So the superintendent is trying to tell him, this is the right way to do things, brother, But he got upset. He didn't want to be told what to do. And he was hiding these things. And so he got mad. And so then they told him, well, you know what, we're gonna have to remove you then. If you don't change your ways, we're gonna have to remove you as the pastor. Oh, you can't do that. And anyways, they ended up removing him, and so he's removed, right? And now this man, who was a pastor for 25 years, or 30 years, close to that, is now gone. He left God. He left the church. He's just completely gone. Well, but before he left, I had an opportunity to talk to him. And I went to him and I said, brother, you've always taught us about being transparent. You've always taught us about taking off the mask. You've always taught us about having integrity. I said, why don't you go in front of the church and explain to them why you're doing what you're doing, right? I'm sure you have good reasons to do what you're doing. Go in front of the church and explain it to them, and then just be upfront and honest with them, right? I'm sure the church will understand. They all love you. And of course, he got mad at me and kicked me out of his office. So that was the end of my conversation with him. So then I'm thinking to myself, wow, that again, talking about insanity, talking about craziness. Here is a pastor who's teaching people to be honest, to have integrity, to be transparent, not have a mask, right? He's teaching this all these years. And now when he gets caught doing something that he's not supposed to do, then instead of being transparent, instead of having integrity, instead of being honest, he gets mad at people for confronting him. That you think, well, that doesn't make any sense. He's a pastor. Does he not know the Word of God? Does he not know the difference between right and wrong? How can he do this? And so that's what you think, it goes crazy. So what I'm trying to tell you is that people, when they're sinning, they do things that don't make sense, okay? They do things that are insane. They do things that are crazy, that make no sense. And so the thing is that there is another thing. There's a group, I'll make this one brief. There's a group of people today, okay? And just to show you the insanity of sin, okay? There's a group of people today, because there's some things that are happening in the country, and some people don't agree with that. They think that there's some discrimination going on and racism going on and all this other stuff. So then there's this group called Black Lives Matter, right? It's an organization called Black Lives Matter. So you would think that because it's Black Lives Matter, that means that they care about black lives, right? So what do these people do? They go into the black neighborhoods where the people shop, and they burn their businesses down. Okay? They burn the businesses down, and they take and steal everything. And now, what are they doing? They're ruining black people's lives. But they're saying that Black Lives Matter, but they're ruining black people's lives. So you're thinking like, wow, that's insane. There was a little old lady, she comes out and she's saying, she's black, and she's saying, you know what? I live in those apartments back here, and I don't have a car, and I don't have a family, and I just come down here and I walk to the store and I go in and I shop at the stores right here. This is what I do. He goes, but they burned all them down. So now I don't have anywhere to go. And I don't have a car. And now what am I going to do? Well, I think her Black Life Matters, but these people that said that Black Lives Matter didn't care about this Black Life mattering to them. And so what I'm trying to say is that this is the insanity. They're saying something matters, and they're ruining the very people that they say matter. They're ruining their lives. They're doing all kinds of things that are ruining their lives. So what I'm trying to say is that sin causes insanity, causes people to do crazy things that don't make any sense. Okay? And that's what happened here with Saul. He, was doing things that didn't make sense. He's going to go kill his own son. All right? And the last thing is, the trigger produces an outcome. Okay, does the trigger produce the outcome? or does it reveal something? All right? Now, there are two examples here that I saw in this story. The first one is found in 1 Samuel chapter 20, verse 27 to 29. Okay? And what's happening here, I won't read it again because of the time. But basically what's happening here is that Saul is asking Jonathan to tell him why David is not there. And what is Jonathan doing? Well, Jonathan covers up for David, right? He's covering up for his absence. So then what happens when he's covering up for his absence? He tells his dad, Dad, this is why David is not here. Okay? Well, that triggered King Saul. When Jonathan said, you know what? This is the reason why David is not here. I gave him permission not to come. That triggered Saul. And what happened? Saul got really mad. We saw the response in verse 30 and 31. He got really angry, right? He started insulting his son. He started telling him that he's got no shame. He started telling him, you don't understand what's going on. You know, people are kind of think that you did something wrong or that you are not fit to be king, and that's why somebody else is going to be king in your place. That's what he's telling them about the fact that he says, you are choosing the son of Jesse to your own shame. Okay? And then when he's saying, he says, and to the shame of your mother's nakedness, what he's saying here, in short, is that he's saying, you know, your people are going to start talking bad about your mom. They're going to start saying that maybe she had you out of wedlock or from somebody else, because obviously you're not part of me. You didn't come from my blood, and therefore you don't deserve to be king. All right? And so now you're putting your mother in a position of being shamed, because people are going to start thinking, wait a second, why is Jonathan not being the next king? Is it because maybe he's an illegitimate son? Is that why? So you see what I'm saying? So that's what he's saying. So he's insulting his son, right? And he's treating him really bad. And so he got triggered by the fact that Jonathan did not give him the answer that he was expecting. And so he had this ugly outburst of anger. All right? I'm going to go back to that in a minute. There was a second time that happened, another trigger, and that one is in verses, hold on. How did I get lost? Oh, sorry. In verses 32. Okay? Here, after Saul goes crazy and gets mad, okay, then he says, but Jonathan answered his father and said to him, why should he be put to death? What has he done? In other words, what's happening here is that Jonathan is questioning his father. Like his father says, bring him to me. He's got to die. He must surely die. Okay? And Jonathan is like, why? Why? What has he done? And so that questioning, having his son question him in front of all his guests, that was a trigger. Okay? That caused him to get so upset that he got his spear and threw it at him. Okay? So what we see here is two examples of when a person got triggered by something and then they had a negative reaction. All right? And so the question is, so was it the trigger that caused that reaction, or did the trigger actually reveal something that was already there, something that was already in the person's heart? Okay? So let me explain this before I say the rest of it. There are people that can be triggered by certain things. There's a thing called post-traumatic stress disorder, right? Post-traumatic stress disorder, which comes from the fact that maybe you have had a traumatic event that happened in your life. And if you had this traumatic event, then there are things that may remind you of that, and then all of a sudden you have a bad reaction as a result of that. Okay? That happened, for example, a few years ago. I think I've told some of you the story. There was this lady who, there's this terrorist that went into this office, okay, and they started to kill the people by cutting off their throats. And so they went there, and they went to the office, and they got this lady, and they cut off her throat, and they killed her. And then they came to this other lady, and they went to cut off her throat to kill her, and they cut it off from here to here. And by the time they did that, the manager came with the gun and shot the guy dead. Okay? So that terrorist did not get a chance to finish cutting her neck. But of course, she was bleeding, so she was taken to the hospital. Thank God she survived. Her friend did not survive. She survived. So she got traumatized by this event. And she was so traumatized that now every time she would see she sees a knife, at least back then, every time she sees a knife, she goes crazy. She's like, I can't see knives. They had to take all her knives out of her house because all of a sudden she got traumatized, and anytime she sees a knife, she's reminded of this event because she literally witnessed her friend throat being cut with a knife by this guy. And then this guy has his knife, and he's having this knife, and he's going after her, and all she's looking at is that knife with blood coming at her, and then eventually he gets to her, and so that traumatized her really bad. So then, she was so traumatized that she couldn't even go to the office anymore. She was never ever to go back to that office, and she wasn't able to handle knives, and so she had to go through a process to get some help in trying to get her back into normality. So those things happen. That does exist. So I'm not trying to minimize that with what I'm about to say. Okay, that's why I'm saying that as an example first. So what's happening here, okay, is that even though, it's okay, you can say that. So even though this PTSD does take place, there are other things that sometimes we get triggered by that we get upset. So there are people, okay, that have this sin and they live frustrated, they live in anger, they live in misery, right? There's misery in their heart. And so they're constantly lashing out at people. And so they're constantly getting triggered by little things. Like anything would trigger them to get upset. And so I don't know if you've met people like that. I have, where they just get upset for every little thing. They get bothered for everything, and they lash out at people. And they tell people off, and they treat people really badly and whatever. And so what you have to understand, if it's not because of some PTSD thing, it's probably because of the fact that it's what's in their heart. You see, because probably what's in their heart is obviously not the Spirit of God, but an evil spirit. And that's what was happening with David. You see, with Saul. Saul did not have the Spirit of God. Saul had an evil spirit. And that evil spirit was tormenting him. And so that's what was in his heart. This evil was in his heart. That's why when his son, did not respond to him the way he wanted to, he lashed out at him. And when his son questioned him, that's why he tried to kill him. Okay? So it wasn't because of the question that the son asked. It wasn't because of the response that the son gave. It was because he had this hatred and this bitterness inside him because he's got this evil spirit inside of him. So what I'm trying to tell you is that when people are triggered by something, sometimes maybe that trigger is revealing something that's in that person's heart. And what it may be revealing is either A, that they do have some kind of traumatic stress syndrome, or it could be revealing that they have an evil spirit. It could be revealing that maybe they don't have the Spirit of God. And let me tell you something. When people lash out, don't think that they lash out necessarily by trying to throw a spear at you and trying to kill you that way, or that they kind of lash out at you by yelling at you and screaming at you. Sometimes people lash out in different ways. There are people, I'm going to give you some examples of the way people lash out. Okay? You're talking to somebody and you're trying to tell them something, and all of a sudden you disagree with them, right? And what do? You see this face, and they just turn around and they just walk away from you. Like they don't want to talk to you. That's a form of lashing out. Because you see, instead of showing love, if they had the Spirit of God, they would be able to be calm and allow you, remember with David and Saul, right? And Jonathan, they had a disagreement. Neither of them walked out. Neither of them got mad because they were not thinking about themselves. They were thinking about the other. So what happens is that if you're having a discussion with somebody and you're having a disagreement with that person, and that person says something that is disagreeable to you, and you shut down and you walk away, that's a form of lashing out, okay? That's you having a reaction that's revealing something that's in your heart. And whatever's in your heart is obviously not the Spirit of God. Because the Spirit of God doesn't allow you to think about yourself. I mean, I want to stress that very well because I see that happening so many places. People that are focused on their self-interest are not demonstrating that the Spirit of God is in them. Okay? Because when the Spirit of God is in you, it manifests itself how? With love, with kindness, right? With joy, like in this case with David and Jonathan. Jonathan, okay, bro, what can I do to show you that what I'm trying to tell you is true? And David, okay, this is what you can do. And then Jonathan is, okay, I'll do it. And then Jonathan did it. And he proved that David was correct and Jonathan was wrong. And then Jonathan didn't go back and say, David didn't go back and say, see, I told you so. You see, if you had listened to me, we wouldn't have to go through all this. They didn't do that. They had a good communication because they both had the Spirit of God. But if one person doesn't have the Spirit of God, they lash out that way. They walk away. They'll cancel you. There's this thing called cancel culture today, where people, like, if you are having a discussion with them in social media, and you disagree with their point of view, they shut you down. They unfriend you, or they just block you, or that's it. They don't want to hear from you anymore. Instead of having the dialogue and allowing themselves to have a possibility of maybe learning something from their friend. So they block you. So that's what happens now, and so that's another form of lashing out. So what I'm saying here is that sin causes that. And so the trigger then reveals what's in your heart. So whenever you're having a reaction, because I'm not talking about you noticing somebody else, okay? Don't start focusing on somebody else. Focus on yourself, okay, on myself. When I have a bad reaction because somebody triggered me or somebody pushed my button or whatever, understand that that's probably revealing something that's in your heart. And if you had a bad reaction, you need to question yourself, what was in my heart? Or what is in my heart that caused me to have this bad reaction? Is it that I don't have love? Is it that I have sin? Okay? And it's probably because you have sin. And sin can manifest itself by having no love, by having hatred, okay, towards somebody, by being angry, by not forgiving. Let's say somebody hurt you, okay, and you haven't forgiven them. So that anger, because you got hurt and you haven't forgiven, that's a sin, okay? Not forgiving is a sin because it goes against God. So that not forgiving would then be the sin that will cause you to be triggered or for your buttons to be pushed. So look into your heart and see what's in your heart. What is this anger revealing? What is this lashing out revealing? So anyways, it was interesting, this story, because when I'm looking at King Saul's reaction, I learned these things. I mean, I literally learned, and I started thinking, wow, look at this guy trying to make himself better than God. Look at how crazy he's acting because of his sin. Look at what his heart is revealing about him and where he's at. And all those things, I hope, will help us to understand that we don't want to be like David, like King Saul. We want to be more like his son Jonathan. Okay? So let's bow our heads. Father, in the name of your Son Jesus, I want to thank you so much for helping us to look at the story and realize, Father, that sometimes we have these really bad reactions. And sometimes those bad reactions are because of the fact that we're trying to take over to do our will instead of your will. Or sometimes sometimes we do crazy things. And those crazy things are done because the sin that's in us is blocking us from being able to use common sense. Or sometimes, Father, people say things to us, and so they push our wrong button or they triggered us. And those really are just excuses that basically really reveal what's in our hearts. Father, please help us to understand that if we can humble ourselves in your presence, if we can surrender ourselves to you, if we can not think about ourselves but think about others, if we can trust you, Father, if we can let the love the love that you have for us, the love that your Son showed for us, fill our hearts, then, Father, we will be able to be loyal to you, and we will be able to show integrity, showing that we really are who we say we are. And not that we go and tell people we're Christians, but then we behave like we don't even know who Jesus is. Help us, Father, to behave more like your Son Jesus. In the name of your Son Jesus, I'm asking you this. Amen. Okay, God bless you.